Most of the money in the world is not where you would expect it to be. About 57% of all the reserves that governments hold, their national savings for a crisis, sit in U.S. dollars. For a country with only about 4% of the world's people, that is extraordinary. Roughly half of all international payments are settled in dollars. Nearly 9 in 10 currency trades involve them, and most global trade is invoiced in them. The dollar is not just America's money. It is the world's. The question is why and whether it can last. To see how deep this goes, follow a simple chain. A factory in Vietnam sells goods to a buyer in Brazil. Neither side touches the American economy directly, and yet the deal is very likely priced, paid, and recorded in dollars. Banks on every continent hold dollars to settle their accounts with one another. Central banks store dollars to defend their own currencies in a crisis. The dollar has quietly become the language that the financial world speaks, even when America is nowhere in the room. But a world currency is not a law of nature. It is a habit, and habits change. Before the dollar, the British pound ruled global trade, backed by the largest empire and the deepest markets on earth. Before the pound, it was the Dutch guilder. Each one felt permanent in its own time. Each was eventually replaced, usually slowly, as the country behind it weakened and the world's trust drifted somewhere else. The dollar is simply the current holder of a very old title. The dollar's reign began in 1944. As the Second World War ended, the major economies met in a small town in New Hampshire to rebuild the global financial system from the ruins. The United States held most of the world's gold and most of its surviving industry, so the deal was simple. The dollar was fixed to gold, and every other currency was fixed to the dollar. The same meeting created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. From that day, the dollar became the anchor of the entire system. But the design carried a hidden flaw, spotted early by an economist named Robert Triffin. For the world to use dollars, America had to supply them by spending more abroad than it earned. Yet the more dollars flowed out across the world, the harder it became to back every one of them with gold. The very thing that made the dollar useful to everyone was slowly hollowing out its promise. The system, it turned out, was living on borrowed time. That time ran out in 1971. Facing a run on its gold reserves, the United States simply ended the promise. The dollar would no longer be convertible into gold at all. In theory, this should have shattered the world's confidence and ended the dollar's dominance for good. Instead, the dollar kept its crown. And the reason was sitting under the deserts of the Middle East. Oil. Through the 1970s, the United States reached an understanding with Saudi Arabia and the major oil producers. The world's oil would be priced and sold in dollars. Think about what that quietly did. Every country on Earth needs energy, and to buy energy, it first needed dollars. A permanent, planet-wide demand for the American currency was locked in, with no gold required. The dollar was now backed not by metal, but by the one thing that runs the entire modern economy. Over time, an even stronger force took hold, and it is the simplest of all. Trust and habit. United States government debt, the Treasury market, became the deepest and safest pool of assets on the planet, a place where the world could park trillions and still sleep at night. Once everyone prices, saves, and borrows in dollars, choosing anything else becomes harder for everyone at the same moment. The dollar's dominance had begun to feed itself. This gives the United States a benefit so large that a French minister once called it an exorbitant privilege. Because the world is always hungry for dollars, America can borrow more cheaply than any other nation and run deficits that would sink a smaller country. It can, in effect, print the world's money and spend it abroad. No other government on Earth has anything quite like it. It also hands America a weapon. Because almost every bank on the planet ultimately touches the dollar system, the United States can cut a country off from the global economy with the stroke of a pen. That is what a sanction really is. Not a tax, but an exile. A nation can be locked out of the network that moves money across borders, suddenly unable to sell its oil or pay for its imports. Few weapons in history have been this powerful and required so few soldiers. How does America actually flip that switch? Almost every dollar payment between banks in different countries is cleared through a handful of institutions in New York. and the instructions that move them run across a messaging network called SWIFT. Control those few choke points, and you control the plumbing of global money itself. A country that is cut off can still hold dollars, but it can no longer move them. The money simply sits there and becomes useless. It is a choke point, the same idea as a narrow strait, except the cargo flowing through it is trust. But every time the weapon is used, it teaches the rest of the world a quiet lesson. If the dollar can be switched off, then depending on it is a risk. So in recent years, sanctioned and nervous nations have begun building escape routes. China created its own cross-border payment network. A bloc of large emerging economies now trades more in their own currencies. New systems move money without ever touching an American bank. None of them is large yet, but the direction of travel is unmistakable. So who could actually replace the dollar? The first candidate is the euro, the shared currency of much of Europe. On paper it is enormous, but it carries a deep structural flaw. It is a single currency, shared by many governments that do not share a single treasury or a single national debt. In every crisis, that fracture reappears, and the world is reminded why it hesitates to trust the euro with its savings. The second candidate is China's currency, the yuan. China is the world's largest trading nation, which ought to make its money a natural rival. But Beijing keeps tight control over how money moves in and out of the country. And the world cannot fully trust a currency. It is not free to buy, sell, and move whenever it wants. A reserve currency demands openness, and openness is the one thing China is not yet willing to give. What about gold or cryptocurrencies, or some new basket of currencies invented for the job? Each has its champions, but gold is clumsy to move and pays no interest. Crypto is still far too small and too volatile to hold the savings of entire nations. And a brand new global currency would demand a level of trust and cooperation the world has never managed to sustain for long. For now, every alternative is missing at least one essential ingredient. But the privilege is not free. Because the world is always reaching for dollars, money pours into the United States and pushes its currency higher, which quietly makes American factories less competitive and widens the country's trade deficits year after year. The nation that prints the world's money tends, over time, to make less and to buy more. And there is a deeper danger still. Every time the dollar is used as a weapon, it teaches the world that the safest money on earth comes with a political off switch. Used too often, the privilege begins to eat the very trust it depends on. And yet the dollar is not invincible. Its share of global reserves has quietly slipped from about 70% 25 years ago to under 60% today. That is not a collapse, but it is a drift. And the lesson of every fallen reserve currency is the same. The change feels impossible, then it feels gradual, and then it is sudden. The dollar's true foundation is not gold, or oil, or armies. It is trust. And trust, once it begins to erode, is very hard to rebuild. So the dollar runs the world not because America forces it to, but because, for now, almost everyone still agrees to trust it. That agreement is quieter and far more fragile than it looks, and watching it closely is one of the best ways to understand where real power actually lies. So do not only watch the borders drawn on a map. Watch the money that moves across them. Next time, we will ask why some countries grow rich while their neighbors stay poor. If this is how you like to understand the world, then subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.